final planet in the process of the evolution of planets is characterized by Pluto. This has been a very controversial planet, and many people believe that it's not, that it's just a piece of rock. But I'd highly dispute that. In fact, to say scientists have made an error in characterizing and saying that Pluto is not a planet. Pluto is very much a planet and is in fact a critical part of the developmental process of the evolution of planets. Pluto is a result of the complete oxidization of all of the cobalt in the planet Neptune, resulting in a very reduced, in a very skeletal planet, which is the final stage of planetary development. Pluto is comparatively smaller, but represents almost 100% presence of nickel, which is a very difficult element, but which is present in almost all meteors and which is consistent with the process by which the planets move from Mercury through Venus, which is the formative stage, then onto Earth, which is the generating stage, where you generate life, then onto Mars, which is the ionization stage, which as it cools down and reaches the Curie point, it becomes ferromagnetic. Then it moves on to Jupiter, where those ions are ionized, they're oxidized, and remain in suspension, giving the illusion of size around what used to be Mars. Then you reach a point when you go on to the next planet, which is Saturn, where it begins the deionization process, and then on to Uranus and Neptune, where it continues the deionization process of cobalt, and then on to the final stage where it is just nickel. At this stage of planetary evolution, all you have is a very unmagnetic, very metallic, very docile planet which is subject to any magnetism. This is a very significant point because you recognize that it is a very interesting point in calculating the time frames. We dealt with in the discussion between Venus and Earth when we dealt with the generative stage and the formative stages of the planet. We recognize through deduction that the relative time for movement from one planetary stage of evolution to the next would be 3 billion years. This is an instructive period for many reasons, because it helps us to understand the process of time and that things may be a little bit older than we estimated. If it takes 3 billion years to move for the planet to be ejected, it means that the planet Uranus would have been 6 billion years. If it takes 3 billion years for the planet to age to Venus, then it would mean that the planet Venus would have an extra 3 billion years. If it takes the process from Venus to Earth 3 billion years, it means that if Earth is approximately 3 billion years from Venus, that planet Earth would be most likely 4 times from the ejection process, which would mean 12 billion years. Additionally to Mars, which would be 3 billion years later, which would be 15 billion years old. We move on to Jupiter, which would be 18 billion years. And of course, Saturn, which would end up being 21 billion years old from initiation. We go on to Uranus, which is an additional 3 billion or 24 billion years old. We move on to Neptune, which is 27 billion years old and represents the completion process that we would move on to. And the final process, which will be movement of Neptune to Pluto, which would make the process of arrival from QSI, or the initial commencement of the formation of the process of the planet, 30 billion years old. This is important because it helps us to see that the time frame for the movement of a planet from the time of its initial, should I say, conception to the time of its completion of its death will be 30 billion years. If you only count from the time of Mercury, you can say the age is a 9-month cycle or 9-epoch cycle, which will bring us to 27 billion years. So 27 being 9 times 3. So in a sense, you can compare the 9-month period of a baby's birth or process of a baby's birth with the same process of a planet, which is in a cycle of 9 periods. And this 9 period is instructive as a critical factor in the natural process or natural law. One of the important things that I learned or I discovered in this process is that the ancient Indians and ancient tribes and ancient civilizations used to quantify things in moons, to say many moons ago, in other words, many moons ago, characterizing a 30-day period, a 30-day cycle. But this is very critical and more important than anybody thinks, because the process by which a planet starts as a Mercury and ends up to a Pluto, which is moon-like, is very critical and which is instructive. Saturn has about 60 moons, as does Jupiter, approximately 61. There remains a dispute for me with 1 or 2 of the moons of Saturn and a couple of the moons of Jupiter, particularly because I believe from my studies and my examinations that certain of the satellites of these planets, which seem to be moons, are exhibiting the behavior of planets in certain stages of their evolution. This makes me believe that there are rare occurrences during contact, as far as galaxial contact is concerned, where 2 galaxies come too close to each other, that the magnetic effect of the power of the sun, the solar body, from one galaxy, based on where the planet is in its orbit or its rotation, pulls or uses its magnetic force, or I should say the magnetic force is exerted against it to cause the planet to leave its solar system and to come to another planet in another solar system. This I have found, and if you take your time to examine it, you would find that some of the planets in our solar system do not, or what we call satellites, do not bear the characteristics of moons, but bear the characteristics of planets with still active volcanoes. For example, as far as I think it's called Ios, which is the moon on Saturn, which still has active volcanoes. You see sulfur coming out of it, which is more which is much closer to a planet which is either Venus-like or at the beginning of its formative stage of planetary development, where there's a lot of sulfur on the planet. So this actually gives us a clear analysis of time frames. Now, if you look at the moons on Saturn, you will see that Saturn, give or take, has 60 moons. This means that the process would have gone where 60 times 30 would be the time frames. Jupiter also has 60 moons. This would be another 60 times 30. So it would be approximately 320 billion years represented by those moons. But very interestingly, let us discuss our own moon. In doing the research for this project, I looked very closely at our moon and compared it with Pluto, and I found many, many similarities, which leads me to believe that our moon, especially because of its ability to be magnetized by our little magnetic force, is mostly made up of nickel, which means that somehow our moon would have had to have traveled through the process of evolution from its position in Pluto's area to the farthest reaches of our galaxy, our solar system, to return to where she is now as a satellite for Earth. It made me look deeply into the moon and to understand what the process was. One of the significant processes that I found that explained this was what we frequently see as the alignments of the planets. The alignments of these planets are critical in that it allows the sun to operate, and I like to use the example like an octopus. So you have the octopus with 9 planets on its hands. What happens in that where there's an alignment of the planets is that all the planets are on 1 or 2 hands, which means the other hands are free. And in so saying, I'd like to say that all of the magnetic force is on those particular 2 hands, which means that there is surplus magnetic force that can reach out and pull a planet into its general orbit. So what I'm saying in saying all of that is that the sun, having an inert planet like Pluto at the edge, would have additional magnetic force which it will use to pull the planet towards itself, being that the planet has no ability to respond. That continues the cycle where the moon is pulled. As it is pulled, it congregates, should I say, around the planets with the greatest magnetic force. So it would stop first at Saturn, which still has significant magnetic force, then stop again at Jupiter, which has still magnetic force, and then on to Mars. So that essentially would be a process that would allow the moons to become closer. So what would happen in that sense is that our planet, Earth, when she loses her tectonic plates and becomes like Mars, the moon that we now have will go to become the moon of Venus, which would then be the satellite of Venus, allowing her to stabilize and giving her the increase in rotation, which would help increase the gravitational pull and increase the process by which we can exist on that planet. This process would continue to allow moons to accumulate. So in a sense, if you wanted to quantify, you would say that based on the time frame of the alignments, which I didn't look too closely into, but you can then calculate for all of the planets, for all of the moons that are available, the quantity of time that would have elapsed, and to get as close as possible to the age of our solar system. This is very, very important, because contrary to scientific evidence, which estimates that our galaxy is only 13.5 billion years, I would beg to differ and to say that based on my calculations, that the age of our galaxy, based on lunar calculations, is closer to 3 billion years old, which means that in all of these calculations, that we are indeed tremendously older than we think we are, and that the questions that would have arisen for other bodies or other forms would mean that we have been around as human beings for many, 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 many centuries in every single planet of planet Earth. Every time there has been a planet Earth, we have found ourselves becoming more and more advanced. So that would explain in many cases, how we believe that there are other forms of life out there. Critically though, when you look at the galaxies and how they spin, you can believe that there is a process of travel from one galaxy to another, which is much simpler than we believe it is. This process of travel from one galaxy to another creates with us a very clear picture of the original thoughts of the first chapter that I discussed, which is the position of Christopher Columbus. The time has now come for us to look at outer space not as an irregular, latently scary location, but to begin to embrace it as a very real objective, and to begin to find answers, not only to move above to planets nearby, but to look at movement to planets in other galaxies which are close by, and to move on to the words of Immanuel Kant of existentialism, where you move into understanding that not because you cannot see something, it means that it isn't there. And not because a tree falls in the forest and you don't hear it, it means it doesn't make a sound. So this is the end of the number of clips. I hope it has been informative, and I hope that you have found it interesting enough to proceed to investigate on your own, to seek and so to find. If you would like more details and more information, my book is available on Amazon.com under the heading Origins of Planets. Enjoy your reading, and I'm always open to any questions and comments which will achieve greater seeking and which will all go well for the development of the understanding of the origins of planets.